All right, we're continuing. Apologize for that. We're continuing with our World War II lecture. This one is for the section entitled "The Allied Victory." Let's see how this ended in Europe in particular. And so this is a map of Europe. You can see the Axis powers, the ones that were Germany, Italy, and then the areas that they controlled, countries that were allied countries, and then neutral countries as well that didn't take a side one way or the other. All right, let's start with this. We're going to go slightly out of order here, so bear with me. But this is the individual who is in charge of the British troops in North Africa. We saw in an earlier section that the German commander of the troops in North Africa was Rommel, but this is the British one. The British had territory in Egypt that was part of their imperial kingdom. We've seen that in an earlier chapter, and so that's where they fought. All right, the Allies started in North Africa on the other side. They landed on the Atlantic coast of North Africa, and the British were already fighting the Germans in Egypt, and then they pushed towards each other and met about in the middle, and surrounded the Germans that way. This was called Operation Torch. So you got 1 and 3 here, and then Bernard Montgomery was the leader of the British troops there. All right. Something I always like to mention at this point is if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, I think that's a great movie, particularly that opening scene on the beach in Normandy. But after all that is done, there's a very quick scene that I think is really interesting. One of the people who survives the beach at Normandy, one of the main characters, after they're done breaking through the German lines, he reaches into the ground and grabs some dirt and throws it into a little metal container, and then takes that metal container and throws it into his bag. And you see for just a split second, there's a bunch of containers in there, and they're all labeled from different places. Like one says North Africa, one says Italy, and it really gives you an idea of where a American soldier who survived, the different places that they would have experienced during World War II. And this is one of the first areas that American troops are involved in World War II is North Africa. All right, once they met the Germans, it makes sense because this is a natural jumping point from North Africa into the European continent. The Allies jumped onto Sicily, and then from Sicily they into Italy. The Allies described Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe. If you think of a turtle, the turtle's outer shell is pretty hard and impenetrable, but the underbelly of the turtle is soft and vulnerable. And so the Allies viewed Italy as that soft, vulnerable part of a very heavily fortified Europe. All right, another aspect of World War II was societies that got involved. And the civilian populations that got involved. So there's a couple of aspects of this I wanted to look at here. All right, and for an American civilian, this is pretty obvious, and I'm sure you already know it, but just to write it down. Obviously, if you were an American civilian, the war was a different experience for you than it was for a European civilian. A lot of Americans got letters. There's been movies and things that encapsulate that, where you do a letter that your loved one had passed away in the war, and that was difficult and life changing. But America was not physically destroyed like Europe was physically destroyed, and so European civilians experienced a different war than American civilians did. A lot of things were done. This is one thing in particular that was done that's pretty popular during the World War era, and this is a ration book. So if you look at this, these are coupons, and each day or week you rip out a coupon and you can redeem it for the food that you need. But it was restricted. You couldn't just go any day you want, like for milk, for instance. If your day was Tuesday and you ran out before Tuesday, you had to just make it work until the next Tuesday when you could get your milk again. And they did this so that they could make sure that the troops had the supplies they needed first, and then people back at home made sacrifices to make that happen. And these ration books were one way of doing it. It almost looks like food stamps, but it's not because of income, it's because of what's going on in the world. All right, governments also got heavily involved in World War II, and there were some a lot of propaganda. This is the unfortunately the worst example, the worst result of American propaganda in World War II is the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States. Now, they weren't executed like Jews were in Europe, but they were rounded up, and a lot of these Japanese people lost their rights and they lost their property, and they were dehumanized and not treated as citizens. And the most particularly offensive part of this is a group of these Japanese called Nisei. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And they're an important group because these were Japanese people that were born in America, so they were citizens. They didn't immigrate or didn't have status. They were actual citizens, and they were rounded up and thrown in here after Pearl Harbor as well. All right. So after Italy was liberated, you see that the natural jumping off point here from North Africa is Italy and all the way through. And the Allies liberated Italy, and the Italian people turned in a really drastic way on Mussolini, and they actually invaded the palace and strung him up in public and kind of gutted him like a fish. It was pretty gruesome, but to tell that the Italian people were really unhappy with Mussolini. But Italy was liberated, and so now the Allies decided we have to find another place. We have to find a spot in this well-fortified empire here that the Germans have and just make an attack. And so the code name for this invasion of France, which is where they decided to land, because France, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in France, and France was a major Western power, so if they could liberate France, that would go a long way to helping the Allies defeat the Germans. This was called Operation Overlord, and there's a couple of significant people here. Let's see. But in this one day of fighting on the beach of Normandy, that's like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, if you've seen that, over 2,700 people died just in that one attack alone. It was just kind of like, you've seen beaches. They're not known for their cover. So it's just ships landing on the beach and troops charging at fortified machine guns that were aimed right at them. Eventually, the Allies broke through the German fortifications. It's kind of a miracle at this place called St. Lo, and they continued the assault and ultimately getting all the way to Berlin. Once these forces liberated France and started moving toward Berlin, there was one last offensive that the Germans tried before, just to keep all the Allies out, as they were kind of getting closer and closer to Germany. If you see the line here, this line right here, this purple dotted line, was the German. This is and the red arrows coming from Germany. That's the supply line of the Allies, and the Germans pushed in and almost broke through the supply lines right here, and stretched it out. But weren't able to completely break through. It's like if you pushed a sharp object through a balloon, it would stretch, and it really would take a lot to break through that. So this battle is unfortunately named the Battle of the Bulge. The people who fought in this battle weren't taking into account future world history teachers that would have to teach this to high school students going forward. So this is called the Battle of the Bulge. It's the last attempt by the Germans to push back on the Allied advance, and this failed. Almost succeeded, but failed. And that was pretty much the last thing the Germans could do to stop the Allies from marching all the way to Berlin. Right, so this is a symbol to show what was going on from a German perspective for the Germans after the Battle of the Bulge. And that's this noose symbolizes, it's ironic for a couple different reasons, but anyway, it's enemies coming in from two sides on the Germans. The Russians were coming in from the east. The Allies were coming in from the west, the French and the Americans and the British. And so this, was tightening around Germans' neck. So a couple of last actions of Hitler here. Action number one, he actually married his longtime companion. This was a German actress, Eva Braun. There's a lot of questions there, but we'll leave that one alone. And then after that, once they knew the end was coming, they had, they got married. They probably had this nice meal. Then they did the Romeo and Juliet thing. whereas they killed themselves together in Hitler's bunker. I guess the guard outside the room waited for two thuds, and then they went in. They collected these bodies and carried them outside and essentially cremated them. Hitler did not want to be captured by the Allies, and he also didn't want his body like put on display or used in any way. It was sort of a last act of defiance. But because this is kind of you know, difficult to prove, once you cremate a body, there's no way of knowing for sure. This leads itself to a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened to Hitler after World War II. A lot of German soldiers factually escaped Germany and fled to South America, believe it or not. And so they kind of hid within South America. That was their plan in case anything bad happened. And so some people believe that Hitler escaped to South America and lived out the rest of his life. It's probably doubtful he'd still be alive now if that was the case. So maybe Hitler spent the rest of his life as a pig farmer in South America. Who knows? But the greater likelihood is that he committed suicide here because he didn't want to be captured by the Allies. All right, back in the United States, leadership had changed. Franklin Roosevelt, who had polio, passed away, and his vice president, as always happens when the president dies, stepped up and became president. That's Harry Truman. And Harry Truman presided over the United States when the European theater of World War II ended, and that was referred to as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. May 9th, 1945. All right, in the Pacific, there was some other things going on, simultaneous fighting, but then obviously once the European theater is over, the United States could focus all their attention on what was going on in the Pacific. All right, so there's a couple of islands in particular. Remember, they were doing the island hopping thing, jumping from strategic location to strategic location. So when it came down to the end, two strategic islands that really helped them start planning the invasion of Japan. One was Iwo Jima. If you've been to Washington, D.C., you may have seen the Iwo Jima Memorial. It's a pretty famous thing with all the soldiers holding the flag up. Apparently, from what I understand, I haven't been there personally. If you go there, there's actually an extra hand in the sculpture that doesn't seem to belong to a body. So you can look at that the next time you go to D.C. And then the second island of significance was Okinawa. This is important for two reasons, because geographically it's close enough to Japan to launch a major attack on the island, and secondly, it's from where Mr. Miyagi was from, and so obviously that is a priority and needs to be liberated. All right, the problem with these two islands, you can see how small they are. You can't even see them on these things here, and yet to take these two islands, it cost over 100,000 lives just to take these two little islands. We've already talked about how the Japanese would fight to the last person. They wouldn't surrender. They felt it was dishonorable. And it was a really, really hard fighting to take even a small island in the Pacific. So I think that's probably what lent itself to an alternative to invading Japan. So back in the United States, a couple of individuals were thinking this. You probably recognize this guy. This is Robert Oppenheimer over here. He's a famous scientist. And they were discussing this new technique codenamed the Manhattan Project, very hush-hush. And so this was something that was being discussed back home. They were obviously developing the atomic bomb. This is one of the first atomic bombs. This is actually question 19. The first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico. If you've been to New Mexico, you know why this is the perfect place to test a nuclear bomb. Because the only people that would really care about that are a couple of scorpions and lizards and things like that. Little known fact, you may not have known this, but you can actually survive a nuclear bomb blast by jumping into a refrigerator. I'll let you research that. This is how many people were projected to die if the Allies, the United States, invaded the island of Japan. This is all total between the two sides. 500,000 people dead to take Japan and subdue it and invade it and things like that. So that's a lot of people dying, and a lot of which would be Japanese, maybe more of which would be Japanese, but a lot of people would die because of the way the Japanese fought and how difficult the fighting was in the Pacific. This was their pretty accurate guess about how many people would lose their lives if a ground assault was launched. So the United States decided with this new technology, instead of having 500,000 people die, a large percentage of which would be Americans, a better solution would be to have all those deaths be Japanese, I guess. I say that sarcastically, even though it's not really funny. So they dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this caused the deaths of 150,000 people or so instantly. We know because we understand radiation and atomic energy now, we understand that there were deaths way beyond the initial amount of deaths that went on for years. Before you think the United States was totally heartless, they did warn the Japanese that they had this massive weapon of destruction. But if you think about it from the Japanese perspective, if you were fighting a war with a country and they said, we have a weapon that's more destructive than anything you've ever seen, and if you don't surrender right now, we're going to use it on you, pretty unlikely that you would take their word for that. So the United States dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and then they told the Japanese, hey, we got this bomb, you've seen what it does, surrender or we'll drop another one. And to the Japanese credit, they refused, and another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And the United States went back to Japan and said, again, you've seen 2, we're going to drop another one, you better surrender. Luckily, the Japanese surrendered because the United States only had 2, and that would have been awkward going forward, but that was the end of it right there. The Japanese surrendered on this location here. This is on the USS Missouri, and this is where they signed their surrender, where the war in the Pacific ended. You can actually go aboard the USS Missouri still today. And one time when we were in Hawaii, it was docked in Pearl Harbor there, and you could go on, and there's this giant commemorative plaque on the deck where this arrangement was signed in World War II. And this was General MacArthur was the one who received this and received the surrender from the Japanese.